This is episode 274 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I'm very pleased to be joined this week by Zac Fort of the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association. Welcome back to the show, Zac.
Hey, Paul. Thanks for having me on again. I appreciate it.
And of course, we're talking about the New Mexico legislative session by and large here, which is now trucking towards halfway complete. And, to be honest, at the beginning, we've been talking about this for a few weeks. Didn't seem like there was going to be a lot of discussion of guns, and then whammo, as it seems to happen sometimes in a 60-day session, filed bills, things that, I don't know, you didn't know, I didn't know were going to be introduced.
Yeah, we had heard some rumors that there were going to be some coming. We were just kind of sitting around waiting for it to drop because they don't give you the bills before they file them, particularly in this case, especially in this issue. They don't work. They try not to work with us, as it often is. So we knew that there was probably going to be at least one or two, and then we were sitting there in pre-file. Nothing happened. And then about, I think it was around 2 weeks ago, they just dropped a whole bunch all at once.
Yeah, they don't work with you. That's just part of doing business here in New Mexico, and especially in a virtual session. I definitely want to get your thoughts on how that's going to affect things. But before we get too far down that track, let's talk real quickly about the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association. What is it? Who can be a part of it? And how can folks out there help push back against anti-gun legislation, especially at the state level here?
So New Mexico Shooting Sports Association was founded in 1935. We exist in New Mexico to further the shooting sports, and a very large part now in New Mexico that includes defending the right of people to participate in the shooting sports, because a number of these bills and legislation that were coming through could effectively end most shooting sports competitions in New Mexico, particularly with some of the bills we're going to talk about today. There's a very real possibility that they would no longer be able to host shooting sports competitions. So, that's our purpose. We do some stuff with actual shooting sports competitions, helping put stuff on, do training programs, things like that. But then, we also, over the last couple of years, we have had to develop a political presence in New Mexico to be a voice from New Mexico for New Mexicans on our right to keep and bear arms, not only under the United States Constitution, but in Section 2, Article 6 of the state constitution, we also have a constitutional right to keep and bear arms. So there's kind of that dual right under the federal and state constitution for our right to keep and bear arms in New Mexico.
And your website, and also if people want to subscribe to your newsletter or whatever, engage with the legislature.
Yes, definitely. Our website is nmssa.org. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and MeWe, I believe. I think we just created a page there. We send out free legislative alerts from our website. You can sign up for our legislative alerts there. They're totally free. You don't have to be a member to get those alerts, and we keep you up oftentimes on the day of when things are happening, how things are progressing. Sending out talking points to people, putting out which committees bills are going to be in, things like that, and that's totally free. It's a service that we provide to the people of New Mexico.
Yeah, and briefly, again, the legislature. We knew the folks based on the last few years worth of elections wasn't going to be very amenable to the gun rights of New Mexicans, but on a variety of issues, even moderate Democrats of the past were so much better on these issues than the Democrats are now. And I'm going to throw out one, Bill Richardson. Talk about the way that party has shifted here in New Mexico on gun rights.
So there definitely has been a very marked shift in the Democratic Party of New Mexico on that issue, because it used to be there were a lot of pro-gun Democrats, and I would actually still say, particularly when you go into rural New Mexico, in a lot of those places that are still majority Democrat, those are actually still very pro-gun, because when we've had The sheriffs who have stood up for our right to keep and bear arms in New Mexico, a number of those sheriffs are actually Democrats, not Republicans, but they're sheriffs who primarily come from the rural parts of the state. But really, what's happened with the Democratic Party as it's shifted away from, they used to be more statewide, they're mostly concentrated within the metropolitan areas of Santa Fe, Las Cruces, Albuquerque. As the demographics of the party have shifted from rural to urban, that political issue has changed, where it's become very hard to be a pro-gun Democrat, and that's actually an issue that it's a wedge issue that some of the progressives have used to take out some of the more moderate Democrats. Is that issue of guns um, in primaries? So there has been a very market shift. It used to be most Democrats in New Mexico were pro-gun, and actually it was kind of split 50-50, where we had Republicans who weren't as pro-gun as they are now. And that's not to say every Republican is not pro-gun. I know there's some who are not, but for the most part, it's kind of shifted along party lines, particularly as we've moved to this rural-urban divide in the political parties in the United States. So that's not exclusive to New Mexico. We are actually seeing this subcurrent now within some of the Democratic Party, particularly, the people who are there. Some of the Democratic Party, they've gone so far left that if you actually go far enough to the left, you actually begin to find some actual support for gun rights again, because people are questioning, do we need to make this a law enforcement issue? We've seen some of that discussion, but if you really just pare it down to, do we need to involve law enforcement in this issue, you can actually begin to find some real tepid, very tepid support, but support there on the very far left for gun rights. And that's kind of been an issue that, we're watching right now. We've seen in a couple states recently, like in Virginia, where, there were a whole bunch of anti-gun bills that got brought up. And actually there was enough pullback from that very far segment of the left that is a little, I don't want to say they're necessarily pro-gun, but they're not, it's more anti police and trying to resolve things without some type of law enforcement involvement. And when you have gun laws, they very often involve law enforcement, whether that's state or federal.
Yeah. So uh, you think it's the urban rural shift primarily, and that the political parties are just following in line with that, or do you think there's been a fundamental shift just with the parties?
I think a lot of, in my opinion, obviously I could be wrong in this,
Hmm.
but in my opinion, a lot of it does follow the rural urban shift
Sure.
that we've seen. In Now, this is not exclusive to New Mexico. This is very much
Right.
nationwide that we're seeing. There has been, there's been a very marked shift, and some of the large donors on the Democratic Party side, that they've put a whole lot of money into kind of making this a wedge issue for them, and I think that kind of serves their own purposes in a lot of ways, but a lot of it does follow this urban rural divide.
All right. Well, let's get into it. Let's talk about some of the top issues as we see them in the legislature. So I don't know if you want to talk about the highest priority, the most dangerous, the ones that are most likely to pass, but uh, talk about kind of the major threats you see to gun rights as so far introduced in the New Mexico legislature. And we're doing this interview on February the 9th. I don't know exactly when the drop dead time for bill introduction
Is
is,
it
but
the 18th?
okay,
I think it
so
might be the
we're
18th.
getting we're getting to that point.
Yeah, about a little bit more than a week away.
Could be a surprise, but of course, then they would have to pass it through. But
I think we are expecting maybe one or two more surprise bills at this
okay,
point. We saw a bunch come in. So really, there's four main bills that we're tracking right now.
okay,
Two of them are, I guess they would be not as bad. I'll put it that way. So the first one would be House Bill 102. So that one, it's a little different of a bill because it's really what it is. It doesn't actually create a new law. It creates a new committee, appointed committee, with a funding appropriation for that committee. So what this it creates a firearms violence and injury prevention committee. I believe that's the name of it. That's probably not quite verbatim,
mm-hmm.
but what it is, it's a committee appointed by the New Mexico Department of Health that would be appropriated $10 million per year to study the issue of quote unquote gun violence. And they use the term gun violence a lot because it puts the blame on an inanimate object. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the problem is not the firearm itself; it's the problem is the lack of economic opportunity. The problem is the lack of educational opportunity. The problem is, these deep-seated socioeconomic issues. But if they just package it all up and call it gun violence, they can blame it on gun owners and conservative libertarian ideals that support firearms ownership. So it's really just a political ploy to call it gun violence because it's really just violence, but they like to package it up and kind of use that as a marketing tactic. So what this committee would do is they would be appropriated about $10 million per year from the state to fund studies, but also 50% of the money would be required to go to quote unquote community based organizations for violence intervention. And I want to pause here really quickly because there have been some promise, using funding through police departments for, I guess, quote unquote violence intervention programs where basically they seek out community. Mediators in the community who can help, when there are different groups who are having some type of quarrel or issue with one another, to seek out ways to resolve it that does not result in violence and someone getting shot or killed. There have been, particularly in Oakland, California, there have been some promise with this, and it doesn't involve creating laws. It just involves, building community relations through identified mediators. So we're not opposed to those style programs.
Hmm.
But what we're opposed to is taking money and giving it to groups to lobby against our rights, because that's quite frankly what we foresee that this could become. So under in federal law, there is what is known as a quote unquote Dickey Amendment. It gets a lot of hate from the left, but basically what it says is it doesn't say you can't study the issue of people getting shot or killed in America. It just says you cannot use taxpayer dollars to lobby against your right to keep and bear arms. It's saying you can't use taxpayer dollars to lobby against taxpayer rights. That's basically what it says. But with this in New Mexico, would actually take the opposite approach, whereas basically, we're going to take taxpayer dollars to lobby against taxpayer rights. And we're opposed to that. We believe that, most people should be opposed. That the government should not be using your money to change laws to take away your rights the way the government sees fit, because that is not what I would consider a representative democracy or representative republic.
Well, we've certainly argued for many years about government using our tax dollars to lobby for more tax dollars. And this is especially true in bond amendments and bond issues at the local level. But it's not a surprise that they are putting their finger in the scale in that way. And, still specifically talking about HB 102. Again, this is creating a committee under the Department of Health to study gun violence. The health issue associated with that is particularly problematic. Now, we've been seeing a lot of things that are not necessarily health related in recent years suddenly be deemed health related. And I think you do that for the credibility and you know the power that gives you. But over the last year, let's just say, I think we've all been, hopefully, well, a lot of us have been had our eyes opened by the fact that health experts don't have a lot more information, and they can be just as easily politicized as every other aspect of our society. So putting it under health doesn't make it more credible, at least in my book.
Yeah, and what we've really seen is over the last couple of years is the quote unquote public health profession has really just become another wing of political science. If you look at some of the things that are published in these journals, they really have very little to do with anything other than just pushing a often progressive or leftist worldview. It's quite remarkable that they won't publish a study that doesn't somehow align with their predetermined worldview. And what's interesting is if you actually, if you go apart and take apart some of these studies and look at the things that they're doing, you can see how they tip the scales in these studies that are then published in public health journals and then waved around in the media that, oh, this study says this. Well, if you pull it apart, I know particularly I've seen some gun control studies where it's pretty obnoxious how they actually put their finger on the scales in some of these studies. But that's probably a topic we can go into more on another day. But
Exactly.
yes, the public health profession is particularly over the last 2-3 years has really just become another wing of political science.
Yeah, well, that is for sure. All right, who introduced HB 102? Before we leave that one,
HB
do you know
102
offhand?
is Gail Chasey from Albuquerque, I believe,
Oh
state
yeah,
representative.
yeah, chairwoman of Judiciary Committee. All right, next bill out of the chute. What's our next concern?
So the next bill we're going to talk about is House Bill 193. It is the amendment to New Mexico's red flag extreme risk protection order gun confiscation law.
Okay.
They passed this bill, in 2020. Under, there was a very intense debate on this bill, and ultimately it ended up passing. I think it had a clearance of about 2 votes in the state senate that it kind of really came down to. And going into that, we didn't really know exactly where it was going to fall, but I think ultimately, the governor and her team were able to kind of pull people for harder and further along than we were. So this bill, it passed in 2020, and what's happened is, according to the bill sponsor, the bill's hardly been used. Or the law, I should say now, has hardly been used, which is really not surprising because it doesn't actually do anything to help someone who is in mental distress. What it does is it just basically gives police permission to go execute a search warrant under a civil order. I really want to hammer that home. These are search warrants in New Mexico being executed for civil orders. There does not have to be the accusation of a crime being committed or about to be committed. It is a purely civil order that police are able to execute search warrants. And these search warrants, they're for any firearms or ammunition. I mean, if you look at how small a single round of ammunition is, where could it be hidden in a house? Well, just about anywhere. So these are very invasive search warrants that can be executed for on purely civil grounds. So I just wanted to really hammer home to people, if you're not familiar with this law, this is what this law is now enabling the government to go do. So what HB 193 says is, well, the sponsors say, well, if the law hasn't been used, that must mean that we need to make it worse and give and take even more of people's rights away. So what this amendment to the red flag law would do is enable a police officer to directly petition the courts, as opposed to the current process where a family member has to petition a police officer who petitions the courts. That's under current law. Under the amendment in HB 193, they want to enable a police officer to go directly to the court. So it removes a step of due process. If it's kind of a very weakened version, I'll put it that way, of due process that exists in this bill, because I wouldn't call it due process, but that's where we're at right now on this. So a police officer can directly seek out one of these orders. So what that means is a police officer could actually target someone under this law. In the ACLU of Rhode Island, they published a piece on why you should not have this feature in these types of laws, because if a police officer thinks that someone might commit a crime in the future, they can go directly petition a court to seek out one of these orders, execute a search warrant on civil grounds, where then they could discover any firearms and ammunition in this person's home. And this, like I said, this does not have they don't have to be suspected of committing a crime. It just has to be if they might commit some type of crime where it involves some type of bodily injury to someone with a firearm in the future. And bodily injury could include mental distress. It does not actually have to be some type of physical injury, as defined in current New Mexico statutes and case law.
Okay, HB 193 is Damon Eli and Joy Garrett,
Hmm.
both are Albuquerque area representatives.
Yes.
And you're saying that that one, just to put a completely fine point on it, takes the 2020 red flag bill that just passed last year and expands it to remove one protection from the requirement of allowing these people, the police, to execute search warrants. What step are they pulling out of that equation?
So currently, under the law, a family member has to go to a police officer who then goes to the court. Basically, the police officer can go directly to the court.
Okay, so no family members.
Yeah, and so what this bill would do, interestingly enough, is actually expand police powers and reduce police accountability by police officers themselves being able to directly seek out these orders. So, when we look at, we're not taking an official position on, things like qualified immunity and some of those other bills, but this bill would actually go in the opposite direction of what their stated intent is on some of these other bills, in terms of it would actually expand police power and reduce police accountability.
All right. Well, it's always amazing to me when legislatures pass bills And then, within a year or so, I mean, the bill, what, probably took effect at July 1st,
I believe
2020.
it was on an accelerated schedule. It was either April or May when I think it actually took effect. There was a clause in there that it took effect sooner than July.
Okay, but we're talking about well under a year.
Yeah.
The the governor's health order has been in effect for probably longer at this
Hmm.
point than that bill, and they're already changing it, which indicates, both A, their true feelings, and B, their increased political power in that direction. They feel like, well, we had a big election, a bunch of moderate Democrats in the Senate got beat, and we're going to push a little bit harder. So, all right, well, HB 193, keep an eye on that one. Next up,
So now we're going to go into some bills that are going to get a little technical, but there are some really atrociously written bills. The first one we can talk about is House Bill 166, which is a proposed ban on self-made firearms in New Mexico. And when I say self-made, I think homemade is probably a better way to put it. It's a proposed ban on homemade firearms in New Mexico. There's a whole lot to unpack here, and this is really, at least from my perspective, I think this is actually going to become one of the focal points of the national gun control debate here very quickly, because the technology for homemade firearms has very, very rapidly advanced, and I think that the gun control groups realized, how quickly this technology had come in a very short period of time. So they got caught on kind of their back foot, so to speak, and that they didn't really pay much attention to what was happening. But now all of a sudden they're paying attention to what's happening, and there's a whole bunch of activity not only in New Mexico but nationally as well. And I think this is actually going to quickly become one of the focal points of the gun control debate in our country. So just to kind of bring some of your listeners up to speed, because this is it's we may need to get a little bit technical here, but that's just kind of the nature of this debate. So as it currently stands, the part of a gun that is considered a firearm by the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau is the lower receiver, which on most firearms is a single piece of either plastic or metal that has no moving parts. But that's just what the ATF and their determination has said is the actual firearm. So, for instance, the barrel of a firearm for most guns is not considered the actual firearm. It's just a component of a firearm, but it's not the firearm itself. The firearm itself is the lower receiver, and that's the part when it made by manufacturer is stamped with a serial number that is then recorded by the ATF. So currently, it is legal under federal law to manufacture your own lower receivers. What this means is, you don't have to go undergo a background check if you have the tools and the ability and the know-how to make a firearm. I do want to add that a it's a crime for a felon to be in possession of a firearm. So if a felon manufactures their own lower receivers, that's a crime because they are not allowed to do that. It's under state law and federal law. So what this bill wants to do is actually make it a crime for anyone to manufacture your own firearms. So it would ban everything from homemade antique firearms. It would ban firearm receivers made on a 3D printer, which actually it is possible to do. There's been a lot of misinformation in the media on where exactly three on quote unquote 3D printed guns. There are a couple designs that can largely be made on a 3D printer, but 3D printing metal is much harder to do, and most firearms have to have a few metal components, so typically around the barrel and the chamber that holds the actual round. Because if that is not does not have the strength to withstand the blast from the round discharging the bullet, then it's going to blow up in your face, and that is not going to be a good time. So most 3D printed firearms are actually people printing polymer or plastic lower receivers for handguns and things like that. And that's currently legal to do under federal law. Like I said, it's a felony if a felon does it because felons are already prohibited from owning firearms. But under federal law, you can make your own firearms. But then this bill, that's kind of the basis of this bill. And I said it's going to get a little technical, but it actually says that you cannot possess any firearms that don't have a serial number. And here's one of the reasons that's problematic. Firearms made prior to 1968 were not required to have serial numbers. So anyone who owned a firearm that was not serialized because it was made prior to 1968 would now be a felon. it would become a felony to manufacture any quote unquote component for a firearm on a 3D printer in New Mexico unless you are a federally licensed firearms dealer or manufacturer. That means that anybody with a 3D printer in New Mexico who had manufactured anything like a pin or a screw on a 3D printer that could theoretically be used in a firearm would now be a felon for making that part on a 3D printer in New Mexico. Um, it would make it a felony to provide code for any part 3D printed part to anyone in New Mexico. 3D printed firearms part to anyone in New Mexico. So I don't know how exactly they would do this. I mean, it's relatively easy to find files online to make these parts uh, for 3D printers for firearms. So I don't know how they would handle that if they're going to have people extradited to New Mexico to be charged with a felony. But that currently says it would be a felony to provide this code. And so when we're talking about computer code now, this all of a sudden becomes it's not only a Second Amendment issue, but it's also a First Amendment issue because you could be a felon for providing computer code to someone, and this then intersects with that. For that reason. So it's a mess of a bill. It would make a whole lot of people felons because it would take there's no there's no grandfather clause, so to speak, in it. It would take effect immediately, and anybody who had made a part for a that could be considered a firearm component on a 3D printer would now be a felon. Anyone who had a firearm without a serial number would now become a felon as well. And anybody who had previously made a firearm from, for instance, like an 80% lower receiver kit would also be a felon as well in New Mexico. So it would create a whole lot of felonies for a whole lot of different people. And what's interesting is that from what our conversations with law enforcement, they don't see a reason for this bill in New Mexico. We're not seeing through 3D printed or homemade firearms being used in crimes. Typically, it's almost exclusively stolen firearms. Which, I mean, Albuquerque is the property crime capital of America right now in a lot of ways. So I don't know how exactly this bill is actually going to make anybody safer. It is worth mentioning. So for a non-firearm object like an 80% lower receiver, there's no background check required. So there would be nothing to stop someone from New Mexico driving into Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, and purchasing one of these non-firearm objects because there's no background check required. You just pay for it.
And this is introduced by Representative Tara Lujan, and uh, she replaced Linda Trujillo, I
Hmm.
believe,
Yeah, out of Santa Fe.
Santa Fe. So, freshman legislator making a splash there with this very ambitious and problematic piece of legislation. Again, that is HB 166. And as you mentioned, it not only has serious Second Amendment implications, but also First Amendment implications because the idea that you can be held up on a felony for the mere possession of instructions on how to build something that the government doesn't want you to have is definitely problematic. And that definitely it definitely gets libertarians who already support gun rights, but it has the potential to attract even some principled folks on the center left, I would imagine.
I would certainly hope so. And actually, I think one point that I don't know if Representative Lujan realizes this, but in the way her bill is worded, she talks about digital designs and schematics for firearms. And actually, the United States Patent Office website, there's a lot of digital drawings and things like that of firearm components that have been patented. So I don't know. I'm not an attorney on this, but it could potentially the Patent Office website could be in violation of this law because of the amount of digitally stored information on firearm designs stored there.
Wouldn't a lot of museums probably be in violation as well? Because I mean, firearms are often held in museums,
Hmm.
historical museums, and those kinds of facilities as well. So anyway, but those are just mere details. We know the law is generally in New Mexico massaged well enough to only impact the little guy. So uh, fourth bill, uh, and is this pretty much where we're at, or are there more? I know you said there's going to be more introduced, but four big bills is what you're really looking at.
These are the big bills we're looking at right now. It's
Okay.
it's getting a little late in the session if they wanted to introduce something related to possession of magazines that hold more than 10, 15 rounds of ammunition, or or some type of ban related to semi-automatic rifles. So we're getting a little late for that. It could still be something there, and we don't know. There could. We've also heard, rumors of bills that could be related to ammunition tax, just because I mean ammunition leaves the shelves the moment it hits the shelves, or even before it actually gets gets to the
Right.
shelves right now. So we've heard rumors. We haven't really seen anything concrete. We're getting a little late to do anything major, but that's not to say they won't try.
All right. Fourth bill we're concerned about here this session.
So the fourth bill we're concerned about is Senate Bill 224 from State Senator Antoinette Cedillo Lopez from Albuquerque. And this bill is billed as a quote unquote safe storage bill. What I mean by that is basically it gives a mandate of how you can and cannot store your firearms in your own home. These bills, they've been shown to be entirely ineffective at stopping unauthorized access by a minor or other party of a firearm, because it's already a crime to put a child in a situation that endangers their life. If you have a loaded firearm on the floor and a child in the house, that is a situation that could endanger the child's life, and that's already a crime to do that. You have to keep your firearms in such a way that would prevent unauthorized access by someone who is not a responsible party. We believe that people should be able to make those decisions for themselves, and we don't want some type of government one size fits all mandate on how people should store their firearms. It should be, a personal decision, an educated personal decision. And most gun stores or firearms manufacturers, I should really say, when they sell you a firearm, it comes with a gun lock. If you want to use a gun lock to store, they provide that for you. But I don't want what we want to avoid is giving some type of mandate. And the reason we don't want some kind of mandate is this could then impact, people's ability to travel with firearms to competitions and things like that, because oftentimes at competitions you may have several firearms laying out on a table or something of that nature, and then if that does not meet the requirement, you basically have to have someone for some constantly walking firearms back and forth between a vehicle where they're locked back over to the table, when there are already rules and procedures in place at competitions and shooting ranges to ensure there are not accidental discharges. A shooting range is actually one of the safest shooting ranges and shooting competitions are some of the safest places in America where it's very unlikely for someone to get shot. So the rules and regulations work. They're there for a reason, and we don't need the government telling us how to do things when we already have rules and procedures set up to make sure that there's not accidents and things like that. So it really could begin to impact these style of competitions through these laws. So where Senate Bill 224 gets even more problematic, however, is that it says a child may not access a firearm at all unless they are a quote unquote authorized user. And to be an authorized user, the child has to be at least 12 years of age and previously taken some type of formal firearms training class. So what this means is, if let's say a dad wanted to take their 11-year-old son to go shooting on a shooting range with a small 22 rifle, as I'm sure many people who grew up shooting guns may have, the first gun they shot might have been a little 22 long rifle, and that would be a crime to do that, because that child would not be eligible for this authorized user status. And it would, because it would say you have to have some type of formal class, 12 years old, and some type of formal class previously. So this would, in theory, make it a crime for someone to teach your child how to shoot a gun, because that child would not be an authorized user unless you had met these qualifications. So it's a huge government mandate on this, in terms of, there's no way to enforce firearm storage in the home unless you're going to go door to door looking at it. And what we found in other states that have passed these laws is that the kind of people who do leave firearms somewhere where they could be used by a child to endanger their life or somebody else's life, is that these are often the kinds of people who are not following a lot of other laws, and are unaware or unwilling to even follow these mandates, so they have zero impact on keeping children safe. Because like I said, we already have laws. We need to educate people through education, and not just kind of attempt to demonize firearms and make it a crime to teach your child how to shoot a gun.
All right. Again, that is SB 224. Senator Antoinette Cedillo Lopez, who's certainly among the most left wing progressive legislators up in Santa Fe, but that is a large and seemingly uh, growing group, very quickly growing group. And that's definitely one of the issues that I had heard about, is this whole issue of teaching your child how to shoot a weapon, and
Hmm.
what what legislation was going to impact that. So, folks, be sure to get on the horn with your legislators, send them emails and contact them. Make sure you check out the Shooting Sports Association website. Now, we've got a few minutes to go here, and obviously, this is an unprecedented legislative session. We were up in Santa Fe yesterday. I had a presentation to give up north of Santa Fe, and decided to stop by the Capitol and visit our state police. Apparently, if you want to commit a crime around the state, do it now, because half the state police are at the Capitol in Santa Fe sitting around in their vehicles, which is a very poor use of those resources. But talk about the ways that you uh, see this session unfolding in terms of gun rights and the legislature's likelihood of being more willing or maybe less willing. And I know part of this is just reading the tea leaves, but normally gun rights people are some that show up
Hmm.
in force in the Capitol and make sure that their views are known, which is not going to happen. In fact, I uh, would say that of all the groups, that if the gun rights people showed up at the Capitol in this particular climate, they would face as severe repercussions as probably anybody, because of the who they are, what they represent, and the fact that they might be in possession of a weapon or two.
Yes. So this so this session is probably the least transparent, least community involved session that I've really seen. I know that I've seen Brian Egoff say on Twitter things like, "Look at all these people who are watching on Zoom." It's like, well, how many people? Well, if you really wanted a lot of participation, Brian, maybe you should stop limiting the number of people who can testify for gun bills to 5 people when you have 500 show up. So we pride ourselves, and we get a lot of people involved. Normal committee hearing meetings, it's not uncommon to have over 100 people from our side there present. Typically, they don't give everyone a time to speak. So if Brian Egoff really wants to give people an opportunity to make this as representative as possible, maybe he should stop limiting. Him and his committee chair should stop limiting the number of people who are able to testify for the pro gun side. So it is concerning that we're not going to be able to have our people there to go speak on things. I do want to say there's been a lot of this talk about how they want to handle things security wise at the legislature. In the past, we've prided ourselves in that we get a lot of people there. Oftentimes, yes, they are carrying firearms, but it has always been entirely peaceful. We really push for that. We say, what, there's no reason there's to do things, and there aren't things. I mean, there's no threats of violence, there are no acts of violence. In fact, the only act of quote unquote violence I've actually seen is when someone who was actually carrying a gun got shoved by someone who was on the opposition side. The state police kind of jumped in there really quickly to make sure that nothing happened, but the other person, they had no desire to retaliate against what had happened there. But that's actually, so the only violence I've ever seen around this issue is actually someone from the other side physically pushing someone who was on the pro gun side. So we see this as a real impediment because they're going to try to. I think they could use this as an excuse. Well, we don't see the people there. So, well, you don't see the people there because you didn't allow them to show up. There is going to be a committee hearing later this afternoon. I think there are going to be quite a few people from our side testifying for it. I don't know how many of them they're actually going to allow to testify from prior experiences. It's not going to be very many, even though we may have 200 people from our side and 10 people from the other side. They just cap it to 10 people per side, is a trick that we've seen them use oftentimes before. But yeah, we view it as an impediment to presenting our side because our side is passionate about this issue. We're educated on this issue far more than we often see from the other side on it. So we view this as an impediment, this lack of transparency and public participation in the legislative session.
Yeah, and it certainly is always worthwhile contacting your legislators, whether it's via email in advance, showing up and testifying, which is ideal. And that I'm talking about a traditional legislative session where there is something about showing up in a room, sitting across the table or across the room with these legislators who are trying to take away your freedoms, and having that happen in front of you is something that those legislators have to account for. Whereas, you know, the distance of Zoom and these online mediums. Now, we have advocated at the Rio Grande Foundation for years that the legislature should allow Zoom testimony, whether it's expert witnesses or anything else, for people. This is a big state like Hobbs, Silver City, who can't make it up to testify, but it doesn't have the same, I think, impact. That being said, folks need to get out there and testify. And note that in the Senate, while the House is restrictive in some respects, the Senate, you often have to sign up ahead of time just for the opportunity to testify. So you can't just show up, quote unquote, in the Zoom meeting. You have to actually physically put your name on a list and then be there when the committee starts.
We're seeing that right now on the House side as well. Like for today's committee hearing meeting, they wanted people to sign up ahead of time to be able to testify before the committee on these. It's going to be Senate or House Bill 193 and House Bill 166 that will be heard in the House Consumer and Public Affairs Committee today. Speaking of this is, February 9th in the morning. It'll be heard this afternoon as a point of reference for your listeners. So that they've been asking people to sign up ahead of time for that.
Okay, and just folks also our Freedom Index, which tracks and rates votes. All four of these bills, I'm confident we will have rated and rated negatively in our vote tracking system as they move forward to potentially floor votes. You never know if they will get that far. The hope is obviously no, but
That's what we're aiming for. We'll see what happens in these committees. There's a lot of things they're going to have to shake out on this.
yeah, yeah, it's interesting times, and I think the open question, the elephant in the room in this legislative session is: will the absence of the public uh, make them more aggressive, make the legislators more willing to push some of their anti-freedom agenda items, or will there be some reticence to kind of do a lot of these things while the public has such a limited ability to observe, to engage, to correct mistakes and problems? Because it's not just average gun owners; they get input from law enforcement and professionals and experts in the field, and even those people. That's I think the real danger for the legislature at this point, is that they won't have as many correctives coming at them from people who are experts in the field, whether it's in this case guns or economic policies of a wide variety. It's so constrained in terms of the ability to get that information to them.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I do worry that some legislators are going to be even more siloed than they normally are during the legislative session. Because during the committee hearing process, you're meeting with your fellow members from both sides of the party. You're working there. It's a collaborative process. Now, sometimes is that collaboration or just one side steamrolling the other? I think it's been a little bit more of the latter recently, but we're missing that collaborative process where you put people from from opposite political ideologies into the same room together, and they have to find some way to work together to get through their schedule and to vote on things and do amendments. And even if they disagree with them philosophically, sometimes you get a good amendment in, even if you don't stop the bill. So I do worry that people are going to be that our legislators are very siloed right now and just surrounded by people and reading things from their own political ideology and not getting that experience, that collaborative experience where you have to bring people from all different sides together in one place together and find a way to work. I do worry about there's a lot of siloing going on of our legislators.
All right, and right before we go, I take it no positive gun bills have been introduced. There's nothing out there that you would be cheering on if it were to pass.
So we may see one or two bills still be introduced in this regard. We have seen a constitutional amendment to add a right to hunt to New Mexico state constitution. We support that. We do represent a lot of hunters. We would support that constitutional amendment. I don't know the odds of it getting through. Those are some bills that we are watching. A little lower down in priority list for us because we're not a hunting organization; we're a shooting sports and gun rights organization. But we do support those constitutional amendments. I think there's House Joint Resolution 5 and House Joint Resolution 8 was filed twice. I'm not sure exactly why. And we may see one or two bills sneak in before the end that could potentially be pro gun bills. But I think, there's still some stuff that we're looking to see how that shakes out.
All right. Well, thank you, Zac Fort of the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association. Thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.